Hey guys, my name is Abby Halvach, and I will be giving you guys a short presentation on project management and hazardous waste operations. So, a little bit about me. I have to include this slide or else I'll forget. I'll just blast through it and never introduce myself. I'm the corporate environmental manager currently for Holt Cat. So, one of the biggest distributors, manufacturers, dealers in North America of Caterpillar equipment. I'm also the owner of Vibe Environmental, which is a environmental consulting and compliance company providing trainings and inspections and everything under that environmental compliance umbrella. Previously, I worked for CG Environmental as EHS director, which that's a spill and hazmat response company. So I was there for about 6 years. Got a lot of great diverse experience there. I also worked at NASJRB in Fort Worth, which is a joint reserve base in their environmental program. And then I also worked for a year, only a year, that was all I could take as a regulator, as a TCQ environmental compliance investigator. Some of my volunteer roles include the Southwest Chapter American Society of Safety Professionals. I've been involved with them since about 2019. So I've been in various different roles within the chapter and the regional level. There's a little picture of me down there with one of my cats, Colton. So you can there's us looking really excited. He's got on a tiny hat. And then I'm also the founder of DFW Environmental Pros, which is a free networking group for environmental professionals and the DFW area. So that's a little bit about me, and now we'll get into the meat of the presentation. So, as an outline of some of the things that we're going to talk about, this presentation is going to briefly cover the cradle to grave or start to finish steps for managing hazardous waste operations. In the field of hazardous waste management, a project can look different for everyone depending on the circumstance and your role. So, you could be working at a manufacturing facility that's a large quantity generator. You could be leading a team at a site cleaning up dumped hazardous waste. You could be conducting an environmental assessment for a real estate acquisition, or you could be managing a TSDF. But regardless of your project, most of the must-dos remain the same, and most of them still apply. So in this presentation, I'm going to be giving you some helpful tips and tools to avoid pitfalls and potential compliance problems. Common things that I've seen in my experience that will hopefully help you guys on your hazardous waste project management journey. So hopefully these nuggets of information and warnings will help you in the future and whatever your endeavors may be. So throughout the presentation, you'll see some nuggets scattered in there because that's what they are, nuggets of information. So that's the outline here. We'll go through general project planning, generators, training, waste sampling, classifications, documents, transporters, and disposal facilities. And I'm going to try to keep it within 15 minutes. So let's go. Project planning. So this is the very beginning when you're first starting a project, obviously, or when you're first entering a new job, trying to figure out, the flow and the duties. I always try to have the mindset that everyone on a project knows nothing. Like Homer here with, a little monkey clapping his cymbals, until they prove otherwise. Because this is to ensure protection from incorrect assumptions or applications that could have serious regulatory impacts. There's nothing wrong with double checking, even the experts, because you'll be shocked to find how many people involved in the hazardous waste operations process who really don't know what they're doing. Or maybe they're overconfident in their abilities. Maybe they haven't heard about the latest update, whatever it may be. So don't be afraid to double check. This is a really complicated field. It's very hard to be a true expert just because there's so many different niches throughout. So never assume anything at any point in the process and always double check everything. Documentation is critical. I hate when people say, well, this could have been a phone call or should have been a phone call. I'm like, well, sorry, buckaroo, not in this realm, because we got to have documentation throughout the entire process. Like, I want it in writing, what you said and what you told me, because I can't tell you how many times this has saved my hide. It's so much easier to pull up an email than it is to say, well, you told me on the phone, because that just doesn't work. So it's imperative that you carry these mindsets of never assuming, always double checking, planning and tracking everything that you possibly can with documentation. These mindsets are so imperative throughout this project management process with hazardous waste because it's going to protect you, it's going to protect your team, whatever company you're working for throughout this entire project, and will ensure that you get as accurate information as possible. Generators. So it won't come as a surprise to learn that many generators maybe don't truly know or truly understand their true hazardous waste generator status. So it's really critical that you confirm a generator's hazardous waste status via available documentation before a project begins. So generators, as y'all know, we've got, C-squigs or V-squigs, now they're called, very small quantity generators. You got small quantity generators, large quantity generators, those who may need an episodic generator number. And then in some states like Texas, they differentiate between non-industrial generators and industrial generators. So you want to make sure that you're using state and federal resources to confirm the generator's status. So for example, here in Texas, they offer the central registry system, which provides a lot of helpful information. You're able to see all of their permits and registrations through the state and EPA. So all of that's there for you to review and confirm. Other states have equivalents as well. Also, a federal level, they have RCRA info, so you can get in there on RCRA info and double check registration statuses, especially on disposal facilities. You can see if a generator facility has reported in the past. You want to double check, has there been a big jump between, let's say they were an LQG one year and now all of a sudden they're a C-squig out of nowhere. That's a red flag, you want to double check. Have they ever reported at all? Sometimes there may be nothing in this system. And can you review manifests? Can you get your hands on those hazardous waste manifests to confirm the generator status for the past few years? So you want to utilize any resource or tool that you can possibly have to confirm their generator status, because that is really going to set out a lot of expectations as you go through the project management process. Sometimes a generator might need an episodic generator number for planned and unplanned hazardous waste events. So you guys probably heard about those, episodic generator numbers. Usually those are only one per year allowed, but they will make exceptions if something wild is going on, but usually it's one per year. But regardless, you want to be sure that you intimately understand whatever state you're working in for that project, what are their state-specific waste regs, and how is that going to affect the generator status. So going back to Texas, because that's where I'm from and where I've done the most work. For example, Texas differentiates, like I said, between non-industrial and industrial, which can make generator determinations even more tricky, another complicating factor. Because even if they're not generating any hazardous waste, if they're generating non-hazardous waste that's considered class 1 in Texas, like oily soil or certain elevated levels of metals that aren't quite but they're still hazardous to human health and the environment, that generator, if they're generating more than 220 pounds of that class 1 non-haz in a month, they have to be registered as an industrial C-squig or V-squig. So you want to make sure whatever state you're working in that you truly understand the regulations there and that this generator is registered properly, because you got to remember rules in some states but not in others. So just be sure to watch those generator pounds carefully and double check the documentation and state-specific regulations. So don't be... That's my chicken. He's very excited when I start to record things. Of course, he wants to holler now, so he'll probably continue to do it. But don't be surprised to find that many C-squigs or V-squigs exceed their limits. They may not truly understand, like we said, they may not understand these regulations. They're assuming incorrectly. You show up, and then you see, like all these drums sitting here, and they're like, oh, well, we're a C-squig. Okay, well, clearly you're not. So you can confirm C-squig status. This is how the regulators do it. They add up all the hazardous waste pounds for the year as a total and divide by 12. And if they're seeing more than 220 pounds of hazardous waste generation in any month, then you're going to have a problem. That facility is going to be in the hot seat because they exceeded their C-squig status. So it can get confusing. It can get muddled. If you've got multiple loads, multiple manifests going out each month, So be sure to add them up for the month to ensure and double check that C-Squig status, making sure it's still applying and that nobody's, sending a bunch of stuff out and all of a sudden you've exceeded that and now you need to retroactively, figure something out in terms of an episodic generator or state notification or whatever it may be. And a rule of thumb to remember is that C-Squigs can only accumulate about five drums of hazardous waste on site before they're no longer within those C-Squig limits. So if they exceed 2,200 pounds of hazardous waste on site that they're storing, maybe it's a couple years worth, well, they're exceeding their C-Squig limits by doing that. So even one tote full of hazardous waste can potentially push them over that C-Squig limit. So it's really important that they truly understand their limits if they're claiming that C-Squig status. Training. So depending on the specific work activities, there may be many required safety trainings. So that's a whole nother topic and subject and training of its own. You could have a requirement for 40-hour HAZWOPER training, respirator training, 10-hour OSHA training, whatever it may be. So you want to make sure that all of those things are accomplished before any work begins. When it comes to RCRA trainings, so small quantity and large quantity generators are required to take initial and annual emergency response and job-specific hazardous waste management training. Same goes for 10-day transfer facility employees, so those 10-day hazardous waste facilities, and TSDF personnel. So if you know that you're going into a situation where it's an SQG, an LQG, maybe it's a transfer facility or a disposal or recycling facility, that end final facility, all of those situations are going to require training. So you always want to double check before you start any project in hazardous waste what safety trainings and what waste management trainings are going to be required. Additionally, when it comes to hazardous waste, there are some DOT regulations that apply. So hazardous material regulations, that 49 CFR Part 172 Subpart H, these regulations are specifying training requirements. So specifically for general awareness, function-specific training, and safety training, which has to happen within 90 days of employment and needs to be repeated every 3 years. And this is really huge if you have people signing hazardous waste manifests, because they have to have this training in order to sign those. And what you'll find a lot of times is transporters will show up and have whoever is available sign the manifest, which could be, some random person sitting at a desk, could be the janitor, could be, the Uber Eats guy. It's like whoever happens to be there, they're just going to hand it over and be like, here, sign this. And most of the time people will just sign. So you want to make sure ahead of time that you've got designated signers, they have the training, whoever you're working with as your transporter is aware, like only these certain people are allowed to sign. So you want to have all that documentation in place ahead of time so you're prepared for those types of circumstance. So ensure all parties involved are properly trained before kicking off a project. So covering all your safety training and all of your waste management training basics. Waste sampling. So in the waste management realm, there's obviously going to be a variety and ever-changing number and type of analytical tests that you're going to need to run upon your waste or whatever you're trying to classify. But some of the main typical tests that you're going to see are going to be like T-clip metals. So T-clip, toxic characteristic leaching procedure, could be running the RCRA 8. Sometimes it's state specific, like in Texas, they want to see Texas 11, with just a few more metals added on there. There's also T-clip VOCs, T-clip SVOCs, so those organic chemicals, semi-volatile and volatile. There's RCI, so reactivity, corrosivity, ignitability, and then TPH, so total petroleum hydrocarbons. So, you'll be seeing a lot of T-clip metals, VOCs, SVOCs, RCI, TPH. That is kind of your standard things that will be rattled off in terms of waste classification and what the disposal facility is looking for. So to differentiate, between total metals and T-clip metals, so I mentioned T-clip, but a lot of times you'll see waste analysis testing just run in totals. So total waste analysis measures the concentration of contaminants and waste materials. T-clip determines whether the waste material can leach contaminants into the soil or groundwater. So it's two different methods of testing that material. Got to remember that rule of 20. So you may have discussed this. So rule of 20 states that the total waste results can be divided by 20 to determine the maximum theoretical leachability of a waste sample. So it's kind of your way to convert from totals to T-clip. And you really want to make sure that you pay attention to that, pay attention to those units when you're reviewing analytical. If you request to run totals, the analytical should come back in milligrams per kilogram. If you're requesting T-clip, it should be coming back in milligrams per liter. For solids in particular. Liquids are always going to come back as milligrams per liter. So that divide by 20 is specific for solids. So if you get solid results for totals at 20 milligrams per kilogram and you want to convert to T-clip, divide by 20. Now you're at 1 milligram per liter, and you compare to the regulatory limits, see if you're Haz or not. So you want to pay attention to those units when reviewing your analytical, because I've actually had lab reports where they used the wrong units and it became very confusing. I requested T-clip results. They reported back with milligrams per kilogram results, which was just an error in their system, in terms of what was on the report, but it made the results look hazardous. So they had to go back and make those corrections for me and resubmit the analytical, which in turn showed this waste was non-Haz. But very important you pay attention to T-clip versus total and what units are being used. And then always check with the disposal facility to confirm their requirements. Again, never assume. So there may be some things that are surprising in terms of what the disposal facility is looking for. And all of these things are based upon their permits or regulatory requirements, which can sometimes change pretty quickly. So something you weren't required to test for the month before, all of a sudden, the month later, now they're like, well, we need this test. And that's coming from their regulatory requirements or permit. So you always want to check ahead of time. For example, I remember we were very surprised when we had to start testing for metals, so T-clip or totals, for materials impacted with human feces. And this is not even like coming from a septic tank. This would be like if a man went and, pooped on the sidewalk and it had to get retrieved and sent for proper disposal, which happens a lot at places like Walmart, Home Depot. Surprise, surprise. They call people out like ER companies to come pick it up and take care of it for disposal, which sounds ridiculous, but those are things that happen in the industry. And when you go to dispose of those feces, the disposal facility actually told us, well, we want metals testing on it before we'll accept it. So that's surprising. So in that case, it may be better to treat that as, potentially biohaz waste and send it off for, a different type of disposal. So it very strange. You'll run into strange circumstance where it may not make sense, but once again, it's all about checking the boxes and maintaining those regulatory requirements. And this is a little bit longer. I have a few more pieces here, you guys, on sampling. So just as a reminder, and I ran into this a few times where it made things a huge headache. There is a difference between a hot sample from a site and your waste classification sample. So for example, there's an accident on the side of the road, a truck releases all of its motor oil onto the soil. If you're trying to classify an entire roll-off of soil that was dug up by the side of the road because of that release, I don't recommend you go to the hottest, blackest stained spot before the excavation and pull your waste sample from right there. Because all you're doing is pulling from the most concentrated spot and trying to use that as a representative sample for the whole roll-off of soil that has all been mixed around. There's extra soil in there. And the reason I say that is because you could overclassify the waste. If you go and pull from that hottest point, what you're showing are the conditions of the spill. You're showing what does this look like before we start remediation. That's your true hot sample, is you're pulling from the hottest part of the site to show those pre-remediation conditions. Your waste sample needs to be a truly representative sample from the actual waste itself. So, if you're pulling and trying to use your hot sample as your waste sample, if your hot sample comes back hazardous, let's say for, some type of metal, that may not be the case once it's all dug up and put in the roll-off. Things are mixed around. You've got a lot of extra soil in there. You want to pull a representative sample to truly characterize what's in that roll-off. Which whoever you're working with on this project who's claiming generatorship, that's going to be a huge deal to them, because if you were over characterizing their waste and you say that whole thing is hazardous, that whole roll off, well, now they may have to do an episodic generator number. There may be more reporting involved. It's just a huge pain. So, to be clear and consistent, make sure you're differentiating between the hot sample showing pre-remediation conditions and your waste sample, which is showing a representative sample pulled from the actual waste itself. Because, like I said, using the hot sample as the waste sample can sometimes lead to overcharacterization of the waste, which causes more work for everyone. And then one final piece of, hopefully a nugget here, that to keep in mind, a lot of times environmental consultants, when they're running phase 2 environmental testing, they may run different analytical than what you actually need for disposal. So they may not have the TCLIP SVOCs, VOCs, TPH, like all these things that just landfill wants, or whoever you're sending it to, they're probably not running all of those exact same tests. So when you get phase 2 analytical testing from a site and you're trying to characterize the waste for disposal, it may not be in your favor. It may not be accurate. So you want to clarify and confirm ahead of time what analytical was run. If they didn't run everything needed for disposal, sorry, you're going to have to run more, which a lot of times they don't like to hear that answer, but it is what it is. So once again, if you get that answer in writing from the disposal facility who says, hey, I need this, this, and this testing, then you can just provide that to your customer or whoever you're working with and be like, look, it's required. And then you can kind of shut it down. So just gave you a lot of nuggets there. Waste classifications. So this is a big one in itself. Sometimes be very time consuming. So depending on the situation and the complexity of the generation process, classifying waste streams can sometimes be one of the most challenging steps. So you want to make sure that you're using all the information available to you. Safety data sheets, any previous testing data. Obviously, if you can get a new sample, then that's even better. Within a year or so is best. Getting all of that process knowledge information very clear, very specific. If they happen to have any past waste profiles, that's also helpful. Any manufacturer information. EPA letters of interpretation are huge. I always go and look for those, how they've interpreted a specific waste classification or situation in the past. So basically, the more information you can gather, the more accurate your waste classification is going to be. So, if it's something that, let's say, is like really crazy and you're just not quite sure, this sounds kind of scummy, but I've done it in the past where I've just gone ahead and given it the old college try and submitted the waste profile with the information that I have, what I feel comfortable classifying it as, which, if you're not sure, it's always better to overclassify than underclassify for sure. But submit it to the disposal facility and see what they say. Sometimes that can be a good way to double check. If they don't agree with you, then, you're like, okay, gotcha. And then you can go and confirm if that's correct or not. But, if you're worst to worst, I'll never be afraid to work with the disposal facility, because they're going to know best about what they can and can't accept. And they can assist if you, run into a roadblock. Not always, but sometimes they can. And then remember to watch for the state that this waste is coming out of. So many states have their own specific, more strict waste classification regulations, like we talked about Texas and their industrial waste differentiation between non-industrial and industrial. Another example would be like if you generate hazmat paint in Texas, you can classify as universal paint waste. But if you take that paint and you're moving it, or it's generated out of Oklahoma, let's say, it's not going to be under the same regulations. So you want to make sure that, wherever the state of generation, which state it's coming out of is going to change how it could possibly be classified. So, paint out of Texas is not going to be the same as paint out of Colorado. And then always look into if there are any possible EPA waste exemptions or exclusions that could potentially help you avoid additional hazardous waste generation, if possible. So that would be like, for example, gasoline fuel. You've got old fuel. You want to try to avoid any hazardous waste generation. So in this case, there is an exemption for fuel for recycle. So you first of all, you want to make sure that you look into all the regulations and you understand exactly what those regs are for that exemption. Have all the documentation supporting the exemption. Work with the recycler and make sure you also have their documentation that they're truly recycling it. And then you're, basically covered in terms of it's not hazardous waste. It's going out under an exemption, which makes everybody happy because, doesn't affect your generator status. So always a good idea to look to see is there some type of exemption or exclusion available for that hazardous waste. And then again, never assume anything. You're always wanting to double check with documentations, question previous waste classification. So if you're working at a new site and you're looking at how the waste was classified before and you're looking and you're like, ooh, that doesn't seem quite right. Don't be afraid. There's no problem in doing that and confirming. Never be afraid to reach out to the regulators and say, hey, we've got this waste. This is how we're interpreting the classification. Would you agree or would you disagree? They may not always be helpful, but there will be times where they are helpful and they may confirm or say, no, that's wrong. Which you want to be careful, but there are ways to do it where you're not dealing directly with, the enforcement division. It's with, whether it's a small business assistance line or various methods that are anonymous. So that way you're not just, showing your butt and being like, well, we've been misclassifying it this whole time, but would you confirm? So just be careful with that aspect of it, but never be afraid to double check. Sometimes you'll find if you're working with a customer generator and you're trying to manage their waste, getting a decent waste generation process description can sometimes be like pulling teeth. Like it literally feels that way. Because vague descriptions just will not do. You need to know the nitty gritty. So if someone's telling you, well, it's just wastewater, then you're like, okay, well, that's not helpful. Like, what's being washed? Are there any chemicals or contaminants associated with what's being washed? What's in the water? Is it a solution or is it actually water? Are there any chemicals or contaminants associated with what's being used to wash? Are there any solids or sediment or sludge that could be involved? So there's a lot of questions that you need to ask. And you may find that folks may be reluctant to provide the details, or they may even get upset. I've had some people be like, why are you asking me all these questions? I'm like, I'm sorry, I have to know the full picture so we can account for any possible contaminant, chemical, whatever it may be that is affecting this process and eventually this waste stream's classification. So just be persistent. Never assume. There's been times where, even when you ask the generator up front and they give kind of a waffly answer, like I've had to press even further because their waffly answer could be the distinction between it being hazardous or non-haz. And you don't want to be involved with disposing of hazardous waste as non-hazardous waste because you didn't want to push hard enough. So, don't be afraid to be persistent. Waste documents. As we all know, hazardous waste from an SQG or LQG has to be shipped on a uniform hazardous waste manifest. C-squigs or V-squigs can actually use a BOL, but remember, if they are going to go and file for an episodic generator number, if they happen to have a large volume of hazardous waste from some incident, be aware that they do need to use a uniform hazardous waste manifest for that load, for that circumstance in particular. Another thing you want to double check is that your land disposal restriction forms, your LDRs, are accompanying the waste, and because that's certifying that hazardous waste can't be placed in the land until it's been specifically treated to certain standards to reduce that mobility or toxicity of the hazardous constituents in the waste. But what you'll find is a lot of generators have no idea what an LDR is. You ask them, you're like, where's the LDR? And they're just like, have no idea what you're even talking about. So be sure it gets included in the paperwork for that shipment. And never assume that anyone has it or that they know it's needed for that shipment. Because it really is, just something that waste professionals or environmental professionals are aware of. Most people don't know about those. And then always double checking that the manifest and LDR are signed correctly, the information is accurate, everything's dated correctly. I've seen some pretty heinous waste manifests where there was no final disposal facility listed or there was a shipping name missing. It just says waste load. And you're like, what does that mean? Waste load, which is a DOT issue as well. Sometimes you'll have generators actually sign down by the where the disposal facility is supposed to sign. So you'll have people just signing everywhere. If there are any changes that have to be made to that manifest, be sure that the name and date of all those changes are being made on the manifest. So, if something's crossed through, if something's added, you want to make sure there's that date and name of whoever made those changes. Because there have been times where I've seen it where all of a sudden somebody crossed through and said, it was 3 drums, now there's 2. Well, we have no idea who made that change. Like, well, what happened? Where did that drum go? We don't know. So being sure that those indications are made as well. And when you do receive the manifest and LDR back, if you notice errors on the paperwork, so like after you receive it from the final disposal facility, making sure that those, if you have errors, you can still change them. So you can still update it. There's no problem with that, but you still want to make sure you're initially putting your name and dating, and indicating, what corrections are you making. So be sure to save that document and then also send it back to the disposal facility for their records as well. And then watching that return manifest timeline, as we know, is huge. Generally, facilities should receive copies back within 35 days, but this doesn't always happen, especially with all these incineration backups that have happened over the past few years. It's been really rough. So it's best to communicate with the disposal facility and state regulators who may grant extensions based off of the incineration backups. And then be sure that, if you're actually involved in the process of where, let's say you're involved with the transporter and you have a driver who goes and drops waste off at another transfer facility, be sure they're getting a signed copy of that manifest showing the transfer of custody. Because I've ran into it before where, they didn't get a signed copy. There's no documentation showing that they passed that waste off on a certain date. And then that other facility actually changed the date to make themselves look like they'd held the waste for a shorter period of time, which made us in turn look like we'd exceeded our holding time. So you have to be really strict and stringent on making sure that those signatures are happening and you have documentation of that transfer of custody. And don't be surprised, once again, like I said before, just because people are in this industry doesn't mean they're experts. I've worked with, I'm not going to name names, but a very, very large disposal facility who actually lost multiple hazardous waste manifests at one of their transfer facilities, calls me a few months later and is like, hey, do you have copies of those manifests for blah, blah, blah? I'm like, first of all, why do you still have this hazardous waste at a 10-day transfer facility 3 months later? And second of all, what is going on? So, and the reason at that point I hadn't checked in after 35 days was because we were the transporter. Really it was on the generator to check in and they didn't. But we were the transporter. It caused that facility to reach back out to us. So, the chain of headache continues. So don't be surprised at some of the wacky things you'll run into. Waste transporters. So I've mentioned a few things about waste transporters as we've gone through, and I've got quite a few more nuggets here. So depending on the state, the generator type, and the waste classification, the type of transporter you're going to use is going to change. So for example, here in Texas, once again, going back to Texas, you'd think they'd be more lax in terms of their, environmental record, but they're not. So they've got transporter registrations for regulated medical waste, sludge, used oil, industrial non-hazardous waste, and hazardous waste, amongst other items. So you always want to double check, depending on what state you're in, what requirements do they have for hauling this particular waste. And you want to watch out if you're using a transporter who normally doesn't haul your type of waste, like if you're using a transporter who normally hauls waste from oil and gas sites. Maybe they're not familiar with RCRA waste. We had a transporter that was subbed out one time because a regular transporter couldn't be used. And this sub was used to hauling oil and gas. They were hauling RCRA waste, but they proceeded to go to an oil and gas disposal facility against, what they had been instructed to do or on the manifest and dumped this RCRA waste there because they were just used to doing it. So that's bad news. So you always want to double check, watch out for those habits. And then remember that in an emergency, all of the rules still apply. So if you're looking for, a transporter or a hazardous waste spill cleanup company to use, you want to make sure they have all those proper transporter registrations. Because regardless, EPA, The state regulators, they aren't going to accept, well, we used an unregistered transporter to remove this hazardous waste from the side of the road because it was an emergency. They're not going to accept that. They're going to say, well, you should have had somebody lined up who has, all the EPA registrations to be able to transport hazardous waste. So, just another item of planning to have set up ahead of time and have someone you can call that does have those correct registrations in any case of, potential spills. Request documentation from transporters to confirm that they have what you need. Once again, like just with the generators, you can confirm via state and federal regulatory resources, but you also want to confirm that they have the proper insurance limits. That's huge. If they're transporting your waste and they happen to have a spill, you want to make sure that they've got the insurance to be able to cover that, because it's going to be expensive, and you don't want to get roped all the way up into there if they have no insurance and they have no way to pay for this cleanup, because that is your waste that's now, all over the roadway or wherever. And if you're physically on site and privy to a waste pickup, like you're physically there watching them pick up the waste, watch that the driver has the right placards. Take a general look at their truck. Is there stuff already leaking on the load? Does the whole thing look questionable? Like if it looks dumpy as a whole, if the whole truck just looks horrible, a lot of times that's a red flag because it means there's questionable housekeeping and regulatory practices. So, usually don't want to judge a book by its cover, but in this case you do. So, and also ensuring that you're double checking that waste containers are fully labeled in accordance with those RCRA and DOT regs. And double check as well that they match the manifest and paperwork exactly, because what you'll find is people will show up, they don't look at the paperwork, they don't look at the labels, they just start loading. And then they drive away and they never checked anything. You're like, how did you pass the DOT exam as a driver? I don't know. But it happens all the time. So make sure that you or whoever you've designated on this project, that they're double checking. Everything's labeled. It's matching the DOT and RCRA regs. It matches the manifest. It matches, whatever markings need to be there. You don't want things conflicting, because all of that can come back on you as the person managing or the group managing the project. And then last thing here, making sure that you're watching how they're securing the load. Is it going to flip and flop and spill and transport? That's the last thing you want, is that they're loading up drums and they haven't strapped anything down. There's just things, rolling around in the back. Are all of the containers shut so they're not going to cause a leak or release? I saw this firsthand one time. There was a load of listed hazardous waste that was in a vac box. It did have free liquid because it was a solid sludge mixture. There was a rubber glove that got caught in the door of the vac box. And then obviously it didn't seal, and then free liquid leaked out. And so by the time it got to the transfer facility, it was leaking on the ground. So as we know, anything that listed hazardous waste touches, therefore becomes listed hazardous waste. So that means any soil it touched on the ground, therefore became listed hazardous waste. So that just becomes a pain for anybody involved. So just really be cognizant and aware of who your transporter is, how they operate, and making sure they have the right permits and registrations. And I'm going incredibly longer than 15 minutes. So waste transporter. So one final thing. This is, it always makes me laugh when I think of this example, because this guy was so confident. I saw the transporter getting ready to leave with a load of petroleum contact water, it did have a large volume of gasoline in it. So it was, a flammable liquid. But it should have had, a placard with the UN number on there because it's in bulk. It should have been a class 3. But I walk out and I see the flammable gas, like this placard shown right here on the side of the truck on all 4 sides. And I'm like, sir, what is that? And he goes, well, I'm hauling gas. I got gas in the back. And I'm like, well, brother, that's the wrong type of placard. So he was completely off base here. He tried, but it was wrong. And once again, this is someone who passed the DOT exam as a driver. So you want to double check, confirm, never assume. And then last topic here, disposal facilities. So always confirm that your disposal facility of choice has the proper authorizations to accept your specific waste stream. Usually you can ask to see copies of their permits, to see exactly what they can and cannot accept. They also sometimes will have kind of like quick guide sheets, a checklist. They'll have cans and cannots. So you want to make sure you have that to be able to confirm. And then depending on the state, you can also access online. So sometimes you can get on and see a copy of their permit or what they can and cannot accept. And most of the time, out of self-preservation, because these TSDFs spend a lot of money to get up and running and to continue running. So out of self-preservation, they're generally going to be pretty good about not accepting waste streams that they're not permitted to accept. However, you never want to assume. Some red flags to look for might be abnormally cheap rates. One facility says it's going to be 65 cents a gallon to dispose of, and then you go to another facility and they're like, yeah, it's 5 cents. And you're like, well, how are you managing that? What's going on here? Because that's just such a huge difference. So that's a red flag. Maybe it's difficult to find information online about them. They're not on any other regulatory websites, or there's just nothing out there. That's a red flag. If they're frequently used by oil and gas companies for disposal. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of haulers out there who only haul oil and gas. They come to pick up your oily water, which is, either under the used oil regs, or maybe it's a class 1 in Texas, non-industrial waste, non-hazardous. Regardless, that type of thing can't go to an oil and gas facility for disposal. Those facilities are only permitted for oil and gas waste. Not anything that falls under RCRA or, anything that really is even under a RCRA exclusion. They're just not set up for that. So if you're seeing things come through where they're we're 5 cents a barrel, that's usually my first red flag. When they're using, instead of gallons, they're saying in barrels. That's usually an oil and gas term. So keep an eye out for that. If they have a poor compliance history, no brainer. If they've got 50 violations, probably not a good idea for you to send your waste there. You could be held liable when, if and when they screw it up. So once again, checking those federal and state resourced websites. If you ask for a site visit, like, hey, I want to, we're thinking about using you guys for disposal on this project, and that facility is like, well, we don't feel comfortable if people coming to visit. Well, that's a red flag. You're going to be like, well, why? Why can't we come visit? So that's usually not a good thing. So those are just a few red flags to look out for. And you really should be able to freely request information and receive it from the TSDF. If there's mystery, if there's poor communication, those are all bad signs, and you want to avoid that. And then it's always a good rule of thumb, once again, documentation is everything. Keeping a full list of all the disposal facilities that are being used on a project. As well as all their applicable permit and registration information. And same goes for your transporters. Use all that, save all that same information for your transporters. Because what this will do is ensure compliance and ensure that not only are the proper transporters and TSDFs being used, but you're able to back it up with documentation if a regulator comes in and is questioning anything. So there you have it. An overview of project management and hazardous waste operations. And I went way longer than 15 minutes, but hopefully these nuggets of information will maybe be helpful to you in your future waste management endeavors. So just as a summary, make a plan for each step in the process and ask yourself, what is the waste? What's the volume? How's it going to be packaged? Who's the transporter? What's their generator status? What's that waste classification? What testing are you going to need? Who's going to be the transporter? How does the waste need to be packaged for shipment? What TSDF are you going to use? Have you confirmed everybody involved, all their applicable registrations, permits, and trainings? So the more that you can plan out and know ahead of time, the better off you'll be. And the biggest takeaways here, and I've said it many times already, never assume anything. Document everything. It will save your hiney in so many circumstances when you have it in writing. Create folders for projects. Save everything by category. Save all of your emails. You can save them as a PDF because it will come in handy one day if you ever do get audited or someone's questioning a process or a procedure in terms of your project management of this hazardous waste operation. So I hope that was helpful. If you guys ever have any questions, I'm sure Ashley Gill can give you my contact information. So just let me know, but good luck with everything, and I hope this was helpful. Thank you, guys.